Okay, good morning everybody, and thank you for coming. Welcome to the second annual lecture of the European Journal of International Security and the Centre for Global Security Challenges, based here at the University of Leeds. This is a hybrid event. We're experimenting with people in front of us here and people online, so welcome to both of the audiences. My name is Jason Ralph. I am a Professor of International Relations here at the University of Leeds and currently co-editor with my colleagues of the European Journal of International Security. This lecture series, as I said, it's the second annual lecture, so it started last year with Matt MacDonald, and last year we discussed ecological security in this lecture. Little did we know then that the discourse of interstate security and the traditional discourse of interstate war would enforce itself upon us in the way that it has since that first lecture. And of course, I'm referring here to the Russian invasion of Ukraine earlier this year. It has, of course, revived, like I said, some of the more traditional interstate war-based security discourses that we associate with the more traditional approach to security studies, not least the threat of nuclear conflict between East and West, as we used to say in the Cold War, between NATO and Russia. That's not happened, thankfully, but of course, the experience of and the resistance of the Russian invasion has been experienced by the Ukrainian people. And it's their experiences that we're going to hear about today from Dr. Olga Boichak, who joins us from the University of Sydney. The title of her presentation is Civilian Resistance, Everyday Digital Technologies in the Russian-Ukrainian War. There will be time for questions, so Olga has agreed to talk for about 40 minutes. There will be time for questions. It is being recorded, so do keep that in mind if you want to ask a question at the end. So let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Olga Boichak. She's a lecturer in digital cultures at the University of Sydney. She is a media sociologist whose interests span networks, narratives, and cultures of activism in the digital age. She is an editor of the Digital War Journal and author of a series of commentaries and publications on contemporary Ukraine. Her scholarship adds a participatory dimension to wars with a focus on information operations, volunteering, military crowdfunding, and diasporic humanitarianism. Prior to relocating to Australia, she co-led a project that explored the influence of social bots in political conversations online and currently leads the Computational Social Science Lab at the University of Sydney. Her work has appeared in, amongst others, the journals Big Data and Society, International Journal of Communication, Media, War and Conflict, Intelligence and National Security, and the Oxford Handbook of Sociology and Digital Media. She is the recipient of several fellowships and awards, including the Young Generation Will Change Ukraine, Fulbright Award, and the SOAR Prize. We're delighted to have her speak to us this morning, this evening, her time. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Boichak.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Jason. Hi, everyone. It is a great honor and pleasure to be here with you, and I'm very thankful to the European Journal of International Security and to the Center for Global Security Challenges at the University of Leeds for hosting this lecture. So we are in day 266 of Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine, and As we all know, this week has marked a major escalation in this war. There have been more than 100 missiles fired on the Ukrainian territory a few days ago, and they are being fired right now, probably being fired right now as we speak, hitting objects of critical infrastructure and pretty much plunging Ukraine into darkness in terms of access to power. But Russia's war in Ukraine is a colonial war. And so today I wanted to focus on the role of digital technologies in Russia's colonial conquest, and also looking at the emerging forms of civilian resistance to this colonial conquest. And probably it was a surprise to many Ukraine's defiance in the face of a full-scale invasion. Russia's offensive involved and still involves sophisticated military deployments. But we can see that from the objects of military violence, targets of Russia's attacks have emerged as sites of resistance. And so this is something that I'm finding fascinating about people's ability to mobilize and people's various uses of various everyday media, not necessarily digital media, in this process to forestall this occupation. So let me try to. So first, I would like to acknowledge the country. I usually live and work on the land of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, but today I'm joining you from Canberra, where I'm attending the Australia and Pacific Security Conference. And so Canberra is Ngunnawal country, and the Ngunnawal are the indigenous people of this region and its first inhabitants. So I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This is a roadmap of what I'm hoping to cover today. I hope it doesn't look too disjointed. I promise I have a point which will come towards the end. But first, I wanted to provide a little bit of a historical context regarding the use of everyday media in Ukraine's resistance to Russia's occupation. It didn't really start in 2022. It did not start in 2014 when this war just started. It actually has a much longer history. So I'm hoping to take you as far back as the 10th century to show some interesting stuff that I have been thinking of lately. Then I would like to talk about how everyday media can get weaponized, especially we can see it in Russia's war in Ukraine. And finally, trying to map or to work towards a concept of civilian resistance, looking at different forms that civilian resistance takes in this war, trying to think of more conceptually what it means. So this is everyday media in historical context, and everyday media, digital media, were at the backdrop of major historical transformations in Ukraine. It is often the case that newer media forms have been used by Ukrainian citizens to resist different Russian interventions. This is not to make a deterministic statement and to say that digital media has enabled something or caused something, but more to show the importance of certain media forms and their adoption at different times. And so I'm looking at the timeline from the start of Ukraine's independence. It's a very old nation, but it's a relatively young democratic state, and the roots of Russian intervention go much deeper, as I said, than the contemporary time, and we can trace it back to when Ukraine first became independent. And so that is 1991. And so Ukraine, we can pretty much say that Ukraine has been subject to Russian interference since then. We know that Russia, just to summarize briefly, using its doctrine of reflexive control, often it uses it pretty successfully and pretty seamlessly. And it's achieved by dismissing, distracting, distorting, and dismaying, with the goal to alter the adversary's decision-making environment in Russia's favor. And that is something that we increasingly see, of course, by observing Russia's framing of the events in Ukraine, contemporary events, by observing the narratives that Russia is propagating about Ukraine and about their involvement in this war. And we can see Russia's influence in multiple domains. So from economic to political coercion. So Russia has exercised this much earlier, to cultural conformism. This includes Ukraine's energy dependency on Russia, a near complete Russification of Ukraine's media, multiple attempts to install pro-Kremlin governments or candidates, and also even high-profile assassinations of journalists and political activists. Here I have the murder of Grigori Ivanadze, who was a prominent Ukrainian journalist and the founder of the Ukrainian Pravda, which was the first online information venue, like an online newspaper. So Georgy Gongadze was a very early adopter of internet technology, and that is something he used. His journalism was attempted at critiquing high-level corruption and critiquing, especially as it pertained to then President Kuchma, and that has led to his assassination. But I just wanted to say that there have been many assassinations through the years. This is just one of the many. Ukraine has seen two major waves of popular protests against the rising Russian influence. The first one was the Orange Revolution of 2004, that followed the Russian attempts to rig Ukraine's presidential election and to ensure the pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych won. And another protest broke out in 2013 after Yanukovych, who by then became president, refused to sign a political association agreement with the European Union and opted instead to pursue closer ties with Russia. And this was known as the Revolution of Dignity or the Maidan Revolution. In fact, it grew, and the claims included many more kind of demands, more than just the association with the European Union. It was essentially about the elimination of corruption, about human rights in the country. And in both cases, a Russian official rhetoric used these revolutions as evidence of Ukraine being subverted by the West. We all know it very well and saw it. And this, what it did is this delegitimized their true causes and the public sentiment around them, and really made an attempt to frame these events a certain way. And so I guess it's fair to say that digital technology has played really an important role in independent Ukraine's democratic transformations over the past 30 years. And so some technologies were really pivotal at key moments and were really used to resist Russian intervention. And in the Orange Revolution, some analysts say that this is the first revolution in history organized online, and that, as I already mentioned, is associated with the rise of citizen journalism, with the rise of weblogs, and with the creation of independent online media that actually were quite professional. So they weren't just citizen journalism blog. Those were professional journalists who have decided to pursue this kind of avenue of sharing their work, and they were frustrated by the mainstream media's inability to report dissent, and they tried to circumvent the government's suppression of the freedom of speech. And so that solidified the public recognition of the internet as a legitimate news source, which was huge at the time for those of us who remember what it was like. And what's really fascinating here is that, so the three technologies, it was mobile communications, including SMS, which was new back then. It was 2004. Discussion boards and forums, and email. And so what's really remarkable here is that at that time, only 2 to 4% had internet connection. Many of them had internet connection through work. And so this led to the emergence of these opinion leaders and social or civil society networks that were solidified around these people who had internet access. And we can see that, and also that patterns of diffusion of civic information among the public really became avenues of participation, of the public's participation in public affairs. A lot of it was, and another interesting thing that emerged at the time was the emergence of creative vernacular different creative pieces, including videos. So this is something that we're definitely seeing continue in Ukraine's resistance to Russia's occupation, and this actually has started much earlier than now. And whereas the Orange Revolution was mostly about the changing pattern of civic activism and of democratic engagement, the Maidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity in 2014 or 13-14, was illustrated the changing scale and pace of the digitally mediated protest. And of course, there were some claims after the Arab Spring that the Maidan Revolution started from a single Facebook post by Mustafa Nayyem. That is very much questionable because, in fact, there were a lot of posts happening at the same time and people gathering in many cities in their city squares at around that time. So it's not like one post has really unleashed all of the people, the protesters, but there were a few important technologies, and social media and messaging apps were definitely big at the time. They were just starting, but they were already kind of picking up pace. Live streams was a new mediated form that was very important. It was really, many of us were glued to the screens, trying to see what's happening on different Maidans in different city squares. So this was really cool. This was the first time when that was possible, and there were people who were just walking around and interviewing others. So it had a very kind of a lot of immediacy to it. And yes, citizens could be mobilized to participate in protests. Digital media were used to coordinate protest logistics, collect open source intelligence, fight disinformation and propaganda. And so we see these new civil resistance practices emerge and this is civil resistance, right? We're not talking about civilian resistance yet. This is just simple civil resistance. Through the establishment of direct horizontal links between citizens that are avoiding institutional intermediaries. Now, I'm not a big fan of the connective action, the logic of connective action, but there was perhaps some elements of connective action were there. And it's also interesting how that logic that says that media pretty much mediates this civic involvement in public affairs, that the institutions might not need to play that important of a role anymore. We can see interesting patterns of connective action in the contemporary time, but still, this was anyways. This was driven by the social networks, not the social media themselves, and that is something that's important to distinguish. And so in both of these events, we see digital media being used as tools for resisting Russian foreign influence and intervention. However, there is nothing inherent to the everyday media that makes them tools for democracy and resistance without providing the space for nefarious actors to turn them into weapons. And so I've been thinking about earlier examples of weaponization of everyday media, and I have quite a story to tell you. So this is coming from the 10th century. This is Olga of Kiev, who was a Viking princess, the queen consort of Igor, who was the second ruler of the Rurikid dynasty. And so one time, Igor went to the tribe of Drevlyans to collect taxes. And what ended up happening is that he got brutally murdered while doing so, because the tribe didn't want to recognize Igor as their prince, and they decided to rebel against him. There are some gruesome details of Igor's killing. He was tied to 2 tree trunks, which were then released. So his body was split in 2. It was extremely graphic. And so I guess there is a saying about death and taxes, and Igor actually, his story really encapsulates the inevitability of both, but also shows both intention. And so then the Drevlyans, what they did is they sent their emissaries to suggest that she marry their leader. And Olga received them, greeted them, but then also engaged in a series of gruesome murders of anyone who approached her from that tribe. But that was, of course, because of the way information traveled, that was not immediately known in the tribe. The tribe started offering her tributes. and instead she laid siege to their capital for almost a year. And then after they were completely worn down, she considered coming to peace terms, and her request was strange but not unreasonable. She asked for 3 sparrows and 3 pigeons from each house as a gift. And what she ended up doing is she tied sulfur cloths to the legs of those pigeons, and she lit them on fire, and she released them. So then these pigeons returned to their houses, and that led to the whole village of Drevlians burning down. And so I guess you might be wondering why I'm telling you the story, and this is not to say, well, I'm not telling you the story to not mess with Ukrainians, even though it is, in a way, it is a story of resistance, it is a story of defiance, but also it is a story, it is probably the earliest historical example that I can think of adversarial connectivity. So Olga used an existing communication technology, sparrows or pigeons. She utilized the network to inflict harm on its users. And so forwarding into the digital age, we can also see Russia engaging in increasingly in these acts of adversarial connectivity. Just for the record, Olga is a canonized saint. She is one of the most important saints in the Eastern Orthodoxy, and she's the patron saint of Ukrainians. So I just thought that there was a very interesting example. So the idea of adversarial connectivity, as I said, is just this capacity of connectivity infrastructure of media to inflict harm on those who use it. This idea was developed by Anna Engelhardt. She's a British scholar. And historically, and this is Anna's work, that we're accustomed to thinking of infrastructural developments as something positive. And we can think of the railroads, the bridges, connectivity, it all has positive connotations. We can think of Mark Zuckerberg and his imaginaries of how cool it is to stay connected with everyone you've ever met in your life, which is sometimes it's really cool. And this is probably my favorite map in the world, and that is the 1901 Eastern Telegraph Company System map showing submarine telegraphy. And I'm somehow reminded, I don't know, this is strange, but I remember in the 50s, there was Winston Churchill's quote. I came across it somewhere. I don't remember what it was that I was reading. And he was opening the Uganda Railway, and he said, "One slender thread of scientific civilization, of order, authority, and arrangement drawn across the primeval chaos of the world." And so like railroads and bridges, subsea cables were tools of modern colonial expansion. And there is a reason why they were laid along these lines that we see here on the map. And the subsea internet cables actually were that took over from the subsea telegraph cables. Their locations are roughly similar. And so where am I going with this is that since the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia has been actively building adversarial infrastructure in the occupied Ukrainian territories. And this is a photo of the Crimean Bridge. It made the news. You probably heard about it at some point. It's a railway bridge and also like a regular, can be crossed by an automobile and by train. And so it allowed a logistical connection with the territory of the Russian Federation across the Strait of Kerch, and you can see it here on the map. However, there was one more fundamental development that largely went unnoticed because it happened deep underwater. And that was the Rostelecom laying a subsea cable that would allow to redirect Crimea's internet traffic through Russia. And so this is the way in which Russia quietly took over the telecommunication operators and the internet service providers in Crimea. And then after it was able to occupy southern Ukraine, to occupy Kherson, what happened is that it rerouted the internet traffic from Kherson through Russia as well. This has very important implications on the users of those networks. And so because Russia didn't, right now, of course, Russia is inflicting major destruction on Ukraine, on the power grid specifically. But in the early days of the war, Russia specifically did not destroy telecommunication infrastructures as one of its military objectives. It was actually something that has puzzled the analysts. And this allowed for their continued use by Ukrainians to mobilize for resistance. These were the first crucial couple of days of this war, when Ukrainians were really able to, first of all, show the world what is happening, and of course also to mobilize, to organize logistics, to document, to witness what is happening. And so in the Russian occupied territories, still in Melitopol, in Mariupol, Russian soldiers, and this also happened in Kherson, they visited internet service providers to reroute this mobile and internet data through the Russian networks, which effectively made people living on those territories Russian algorithmic citizens. So algorithmic citizenship is a form, a fluid relationship between citizens and nation state on the basis of a datafied input or trace data of the user. So we can see a few groups of parameters there. There's, of course, the geolocation, where the user is joining from or using the internet from, connecting from. There's the languages that the user uses, and there's the interaction patterns that affiliate or tie these users to that create links to the nation state. So based on these three parameters, there is a way, this is coming from the NSA, from the United States National Security Agency, where they have come up with an algorithm that essentially categorizes people, whether they're American citizens or not, because that gets to determine the whole set of their rights and responsibilities. According to the Constitution, the United States has no right to spy on American citizens, but that right doesn't cover aliens and foreign residents, and this was a way of the NSA to determine. But the concept of algorithmic citizenship has much broader implications, because pretty much it does depend, it does really, it is this disembodied form that is separate from our body, that is constantly being remodulated, reconfigured, recalculated, if you will, and it actually does affect fundamentally what rights we have as citizens of a certain country. And what Russia did with this rerouting was that it de facto subjected Ukrainians in the occupied territories to the same rights and laws as in Russia. So, of course, this was done to censor a lot of information coming in, to keep people from receiving truthful information. This was a big objective, but also importantly, it made them subject to unprecedented surveillance, because that's something that also can be done, having the full control over the subsea cables. And so this surveillance that is done through personal data, and this is not just the data that's going through the undersea cables, this is also sometimes mobile data. Sometimes it would be some careless soldier who would try to call home while being somewhere and would just kind of light up on the radar. So, but this data-based surveillance is a key component of the adversarial connectivity in Ukraine. And it is deployed as part of this larger scale effort at re-engineering the social order to forcefully assimilate the Ukrainian population into the Russian society. And here are the faces or the facets of Russian colonialism, right? We can see this happening through data-based surveillance, but we can also see it happening on the ground. And so this is really interesting, because if we know where to look, and if we look at scale, we can see all of these phenomena lead to, well, we can see them, colonialism manifest in all these different ways, right? And so remembering the map with the undersea cables, right? This is, if you know where to look, you will see it. And we can also see that there's forced deportation of Ukrainian population into Russia. A lot of them are going through filtration camps, torture chambers. A lot of them are being tortured on the basis of their personal data that is revealed in the case of their internet correspondence. There's children being separated from parents. placed in state-run institutions in Russia, and the ways in which their data is handled means that probably some of them will never be found by their parents who are still living and who are Ukrainian citizens who are in Ukraine at this time. And also there is a special placement of Russian school teachers in the occupied territories. And so once we understand these processes that are happening in the backdrop, Russia's actions in the digital realm start making more sense. Because at the end of the day, wars are not just battles for population. They're not just battles for territory, they're battles primarily for the population, and the territory will follow. Coming back to civilian resistance in this context, I guess we're more familiar, of course, with the term civil resistance, which involves various nonviolent acts to protect against the specific law, policy, or government within the state. We saw that throughout Ukraine's history. It was an effective tool for public participation. Civilian resistance, I guess, is just situates this broad categories of civil resistance in the context of war, in the context of a military conflict, in resisting a foreign power. So it's no longer a matter of domestic politics. And it's necessarily transglobal, which means it spans boundaries. It's simultaneously rooted in local, in national, in transnational contexts. And in Russia's war against Ukraine, civilian resistance involves much more than engaging in acts of avoidance, of protest, of obfuscation. And so it is often the case that those involved in resistance turn crisis into possibilities for collective action in their communities to challenge this geopolitical status quo. And so in thinking of concepts and forms of resistance, I find it really helpful to go back to normative theorist, to political theorist Isaiah Berlin, or political, I guess, normative philosopher, and his ideas of positive and negative liberty as liberty to versus liberty from. And so just like liberty, perhaps we can talk about resistance to and resistance for. And so the more negative form of resistance would be resistance to occupation, resistance to becoming algorithmic citizens of the Russian state through protest and through all these other means. And then there would be positive forms of resistance, which would be generative of something, and that could be generative of resources. But I feel like over the past 50 years, sociology has probably had a disproportionate focus on the generation of resources in the process of collective action. So my interest here is also, well, what else gets generated in the process? So perhaps new values, new norms of citizenship, new social formations that get generated in this process. It counts, it's generative, and it's fundamentally productive. So resistance to versus resistance for might be a helpful way to look at it. Protest is the most common form in the repertoire of contentious action. This is the celebration of Ukraine's Independence Day after Mariupol was first liberated from the Russian occupants in 2015. Mariupol paid a terrible price for their resistance. And so following the full-scale Russian invasion, it has become one of the worst cases and sites of Russian atrocities. And depending on the source of estimates, it's definitely over 100,000 citizens had been killed and tortured by the Russian invaders. And these figures are updated daily, but of course it is still, there's still a long way to go in rediscovering all the victims in Mariupol. But the unprecedented mobilization effort that started in Mariupol lives on, and we know that there were similar presentations in the eastern Ukrainian cities of Kharkiv and Dnipro, in Kherson, in Mykolaiv and Odessa in these early days of the war, to really disrupt the Russian narrative and to really show defiance and resistance in the face of the occupation. And so we see that protest remains an incredibly powerful form of civilian resistance in the war. But also there are many other forms of resistance, many faces. We can see this by looking at the social life of the artifacts that are crafted and used to resist. And for example, here's a photo of tank traps in the streets of Kyiv, Among them, somebody noticed a tank trap. You could see it here on the right, which looked a bit different, and discovered a plaque that dated it back to World War II. So it was an actual museum exhibit that was taken outside when it was needed most. And so it's a reminder that in the wartime, museum curation can be a radical and spectacular act of resistance. These are different directions of how to best disable the enemy vehicles with Molotov cocktails where they're most vulnerable. This is something that was especially shared in the early days of the war. You probably heard a story of resistance where pickled vegetables were a tool of resistance. This was a woman who had single-handedly disabled a Russian drone from her balcony using a jar of pickles, which had later turned out to be pickled tomatoes. This is a culturally significant distinction. So these mundane daily acts like pickling vegetables can become a militant form of civilian resistance in wartime. Another thing I wanted to show you was this is an app that connects to one's internet ID and allows to direct air defense systems to spot missiles and to direct air defense systems toward them. So people can, verified users can report missiles that they see in their vicinity, and the air defense would be on it, which I feel like is a very, emerging and new form of participatory warfare. I'll say just a little about these guys. These are the famous Twitter dogs or social media dogs. What is interesting here is that this is a mostly Twitter phenomenon, but it is now has spread across platforms. And what is really remarkable is that these users are generating a lot of support, a lot of aid funding to help Ukraine's military, while at the same time they're engaged in these playful vernacular acts of debunking Russian disinformation online. And so here we're walking into the productive resistance territory. So they're using the affordances of digital environment to fight disinformation, but they're also generating very vibrant forms of community as they do so. They're generating best practices of fighting disinformation. These are crowdsourced practices. They're swarming different accounts that spread disinformation and ridicule them. So, I mean, they're a really interesting phenomenon that is worth a further exploration. And this is another example of resistance that is fundamentally productive. And this is a very widespread practice all over the Ukrainian territory these days. So this is the crafting of the camouflage networks from scratch. There's over 500 organizations that are doing it almost day and night, because this artifact that they're crafting happens to be a central element of Ukraine's defense against the aggressor. And over the years, it's also become an aesthetic of Ukraine's resistance. And so what they're doing is they're cutting and layering scraps of discarded camouflage or discarded linens to produce and putting them onto a new networked plane of representation. So in a way, we can see them as making a decolonial cut from Ukraine's Soviet past by transforming these artifacts into something really different. And so we can see that civilian resistance is, in this instance, a productive act rather than act of avoidance or act of obfuscation. And so these communities see crisis as possibilities to resist Russian imperialism and also build non-transactional forms of solidarity, of trust, and of peace. On the battlefields, Starlink has become the ultimate symbol of network-centric warfare. This is happening in part because some of the internet infrastructure is being destroyed, but also increasingly because it's being controlled. And of course, Starlink works in multiple places where there is no internet connection, but it's providing the Ukrainian army with a decisive advantage. And many of these terminals have been purchased and brought into the country by volunteers. So this is another kind of technological form of civilian resistance that's generative, that's really contributing to Ukraine's networked resilience. With that said, and also it's become a lifeline for the Ukrainian civilians, especially from the recently liberated territory, which allows them to use Starlink to let their loved ones know that they made it through. And it's also sometimes being used in schools. But there's more than 220,000 Starlink terminals in Ukraine. Many of them, as I said, are volunteer driven, but as we saw over the past few weeks, it is a bit of an unreliable technology, and we can see that tech billionaires are unreliable allies in Ukraine's struggle for a resilient internet, and this is something that's really important to keep in mind. There's also a satellite. So Serhiy Pritula, who is the director of a charity named in his name, he had purchased a crowd-funded satellite, and that allows Ukrainians to receive images. Here you can see the famous Crimean Bridge, a satellite image of it, and there's only a few hours delay, so this is almost as much in the real time as it gets, and it provides a huge advantage to the Ukraine's military. But what's remarkable in this case is that the median donation was somewhere around $3. So this is an actually crowd-funded satellite technology that is contributing to Ukraine's resistance. So I am going to end here. I see that we're kind of in the interest of time. We can see civilian resistance as a relational ecology. So it is never just positive or just negative. It depends on who you are and where you're situated with regard to this adversarial infrastructure. And so it often involves interactions with everyday digital media. But where everyday media is weaponized, resistance will switch to other forms of media or other forms of infrastructure and find ways to go around. And it is usually in these cases that it becomes generative and productive. And so, of course, forms can be on a spectrum. It can be more kind of offensive or more aimed at destruction or more generative. And it can be generative of different things. So in the short term or medium term, we can talk about resources. We can talk about new values, new norms of citizenship. In the long term, we can talk about emergence of new social formations. We can witness the emergence of Ukraine's civil society, which has often been overlooked if we look at the traditional kind of Western metrics of civil society. And so I guess I will end here on that optimistic note. Thank you so much again, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Olga. It was a really fascinating, very wide-ranging discussion on many various aspects of resistance. We have time for questions. What I'm going to do is invite questions from the audience in front of me, and then look on the chat and maybe represent a couple of questions to you from the online audience. So I see, yes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Olga. So hi. Is this so there is a growing body of work on civil resistance in the context of civil wars, and particularly resistance against state actors, and what techniques and repertoire are used in that strategic context. And I can see the kind of repertoires we discussed there are very much different from those that are quoted in that literature. And my point was that this is because state actor and state actor have different military capabilities. So, and just I think a comment, I think that framing it as civil resistance rather than civilian resistance can link you back to that literature and establish a very strong kind of knowledge, a very strong contribution to knowledge. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think it's a very generative suggestion, and I do think that there's definitely, because it's civilian resistance and not civil, there's definitely crucial distinctions, and it's really interesting to think about them.
So we have a question on the chat from our co-editor, European Journal of International Security, from Jackie True. So she says, beyond the Islamic Republic of Iran's provision of drones to the Russian military, what connections do you see between civilian resistance in Ukraine, resisting Russia's conquest, and civil resistance in Iran, resisting a brutally repressive, misogynistic regime?
Thank you for your question, Jackie. Thank you. So I think I can see parallels between the resistance, civil resistance in Iran, and the Revolution of Dignity, or Maidan Revolution in Ukraine. I do think it is comparable in terms of its scale, in terms of its scope. I think what is happening in Ukraine now is a little different, right? Because it's not trying to resist a repressive regime within the country. So I do think, but still, it is really interesting to observe the emergence of transnational solidarity, especially here being in Australia, and seeing how the two communities, the Ukrainian and the Iranian community, have come together surrounding their resistance, even though they're resisting different things. So so that is another interesting theme that I'm seeing locally, at least where I'm at. I hope that answered your question. I'm happy to chat more. And I see there's a question from Astrid. When you talk about resistance as imagining or creating new forms or ideas of citizenship, does that also involve Russian-speaking Ukrainians, who seem to me have very much had their identity and history weaponized in this? Yes, absolutely. We can see a lot of dynamic in the citizenship aspect with regard to Russian speakers, coming from the Russian speakers themselves. I guess to begin with, and this became clear. This wasn't as clear in the Orange Revolution. Orange Revolution was very much a nation-centric revolution, whereas the Revolution of Dignity was propagating more liberal democratic ideas of citizenship, in which citizenship was not delineated across ethnic lines. It was not delineated across linguistic dimensions. And this was a moment of discovery for many, where, because Ukraine is so poorly, and at least was so poorly integrated, it was often the case that it was very rare for people from different cities to meet each other. And Maidan was that place where they got to stand shoulder to shoulder with people from other cities and build those solidarities with them, understand that their aspirations are very similar to one's own, and that was the beginning of the development of the more civic versions and civic imaginaries of an identity of a Ukrainian citizen. We know that the first people killed in the Maidan protests, known as Nebesna Sotnya, one was an Armenian, the other one was a native of Belarus. So it did provide a snapshot of that diversity that was incorporated. Of course, there are Crimean Tatars as well, who consider themselves Ukrainians, even though we can talk about the different minorities and ethnic groups who are living on Ukraine's territory, of which there are many. So that is something that is important to consider, because Russian speakers have not been excluded from this identity starting from 2014. They have been very much part of it. Right now, though, there are dynamics in which a lot of Russian speakers are increasingly using Ukrainian as a tool of resistance, as a way to distinguish themselves from Russia, and to just be sufficiently different from a state power that is committing genocide on their own lands. And that is something that we're witnessing, and that is something that a lot of people are talking about. There have been a lot of efforts to learn Ukrainian language as a resistance, to use this Ukrainian identity and fully kind of leverage it in this war. So yes, definitely there are attempts to reimagine Ukrainian citizenship. And but it's not at this point. I don't think it's going into. It's actually trying to separate it from the Russian languages and culture as much as it can. Whereas before, in 2014, it was very inclusive and kind of liberal. And in fact, some of the laws that have required the use of Ukrainian language by state institutions, by different services in the country, there was some backlash to these. Whereas right now, at least it is my sense from what I'm seeing, is that everybody is very much on the same page, in the sense that this is something that Ukraine needs to do to really make it clear that we are a different people and so on. Even with that said, there is so this is coming from the people. This is not coming from any kind of legislation. But yes, I mean, ethnically, there's a lot of Russians, ethnic Russians who are Ukrainian citizens and who are living in the east of Ukraine. Part of the reasons for that is that Ukraine was subject to genocide in the 1930s. So a lot of the original inhabitants of those regions had died, and there were Russian colonizers who were resettled in those villages. We know that Crimea went through a similar history in 1947 when the Crimean Tatars were deported and then Russian settlers came in their stead. We see this happening again. So there's a lot there, as you probably see, there's a lot of Russians that came to live in Crimea after it got occupied by Russia. So this colonization continues.
Okay, sorry, Olga, I'm going to have to go to close there. Sorry if you've got other questions on I see there's one online. Olga's kindly supplied her email and a great Twitter handle at Algorithmic, which reminds me of the concept I've learned today, algorithmic citizenship. That's something I'm going to be thinking about from this lecture, as well as lots of other things. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for those online. Let me end by thanking three people, Laura Rose Brown and Izzy Jenkinson, for helping us organise this event. And above all, our great speaker today, Dr. Olga Boichak. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing more publications and more thoughts from you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.